When most of us think about Algonquin Park, we picture this pristine wilderness, right? A sanctuary of untouched nature. But what if I told you that a huge piece of its history wasn't just about conservation, but about power, social class, and the personal fishing trips of one very, very influential guy? This is the hidden story of how one man's favorite hobby literally shaped a Canadian treasure. Let's dig in. Okay, so our story kicks off in the 1930s. Picture this, a perfect May weekend, just prime for fishing. A young guide, a fella named Bill Sargentson, is leading a group of wealthy city folk through the backcountry just south of Algonquin. We're talking lawyers, businessmen, and in that group is a young, ambitious lawyer named Leslie Frost, and he just loves to talk about preserving the wilderness. Now, Sargentson and the other guys, they'd kind of tease him about his big political dreams. But that's really the question at the heart of all this. What happens when a guy's favorite fishing spot is also under the control of his future self, the Premier of Ontario? So let's jump forward a few decades. That young lawyer, Leslie Frost, well, he's the Premier now, and in his very last year in office, he pushes through this seemingly tiny piece of legislation that, well, it ties this whole story together. The law was called the Algonquin Park Extension Act, and all it did was officially add the two townships where Frost just so happened to take his annual fishing trips into the park. On the surface, it was a total non-event. No debate, no pushback, just a simple act of conservation. Or was it? To really get what was going on here, you have to understand why this specific chunk of land was so valuable, especially to a certain kind of person. See, Algonquin sits on this amazing geological feature called the Algonquin Dome. It's this high, rugged piece of ground that created a perfect little microenvironment. When the glaciers pulled back, cold water fish like trout absolutely thrived in these thousands of isolated lakes, completely safe from warmer water fish like bass and pike. It was, no joke, a natural trout paradise. And you can bet a paradise like this attracted a very exclusive clientele. Getting into these remote lakes, it was tough and it was expensive. You needed a lot of time, a lot of money, and you almost certainly needed a local guide. So a whole industry of lodges and guiding services just sprang up, catering to these wealthy sportsmen from Toronto and the States. This wasn't just about getting back to nature. This was a status symbol.
But to really get inside the minds of these anglers, we've got to go even deeper. Because the rules around who gets to fish have always been tied to social class. This stuff goes back for centuries.
I mean, it goes way back. Back in 18th century England, game laws were actually designed to keep peasants working. The argument was that the temptation of fishing was just too distracting. Then, here in Canada, the 1868 Fisheries Act started to formally split fish into different classes. By the 20th century, you had these really powerful sportsmen's clubs directly lobbying the government to protect their hobby. And this created a kind of cultural hierarchy, splitting fish into two totally different classes. You had your game fish, like trout and salmon. They were seen as noble, sporting, and worthy of all kinds of protection. And then you had coarse fish, like carp. They were just seen as, well, food for the masses, and they got way fewer protections. This whole distinction, it wasn't scientific at all. It was social. It was designed to make one type of recreation seem more important than another. And this way of thinking, it didn't just affect laws. It actually started to drive the scientific management of the park itself. But the goal, a lot of the time, wasn't really to preserve the natural ecosystem. It was to make the fishing experience better for the elite angler. Oh, just take the bass disaster. Wealthy tourists started complaining that in the middle of summer, the native trout were too hard to catch. So the solution? Park officials literally introduced non-native bass, which love warm water. The results, as you can probably guess, was an absolute ecological catastrophe. The bass were super aggressive, and they just wiped out the native trout, the very fish the park was supposed to be protecting. And get this, if introducing an invasive species wasn't enough, they decided to just invent a new one. This is the splake, a hybrid fish, created in a lab by breeding two different kinds of trout. It was literally engineered to grow faster and be easier to catch. It was the perfect man-made sport fish. So these supposedly pristine lakes in Algonquin, they were being used as a giant open-air laboratory. The goal wasn't just conservation anymore. It was about manufacturing a specific, more convenient fishing trip, even if that meant completely messing with the ecosystem. And all of this brings us right back to Premier Leslie Frost and his seemingly innocent little law in 1961. Now, the popular story, the one you always hear, is that he did it to protect the area from a big new threat. Yeah, the common wisdom is that Frost passed that act to save his favorite fishing holes from mining companies moving in. But was that what was really going on? Well, not according to his own government. Check out this memo from 1956. It's from the Deputy Minister of Mines writing directly to Frost, saying there was very little activity in those areas. The whole mining threat, it turns out, was basically a myth. The mining companies weren't even that interested. So what was the real agenda? Well, Frost's own personal letters tell the story. He was using his immense power as premier to basically micromanage the whole area into his perfect private fishing reserve. He asked for specific bag limits, a ban on ice fishing, less road construction to keep people out, and he even ordered his favorite lakes to be stocked with trout and that new splake hybrid. And he was taking advice from his old fishing guide, Bill Sargentson, over his own government scientists. So this hidden history, it just paints a much more complicated picture of what conservation is. It shows us that the influential sportsman has kind of been both the hero and the villain in the fight to protect our wild places. You know, this quote from a famous columnist and sportsman named Gregory Clark, it just captures that contradiction perfectly. He basically admits that sportsmen are self-seeking and devious, but he also sees them as the last echo of the natural man. They're driven by selfish wants, for sure, but those wants are also tied to a real passion for the outdoors. And that piece of land that Frost protected, people now call it the panhandle of the park. It's like a living monument to these contradictions. You've got industrial logging trucks driving right past these pristine lakes. Backcountry anglers are sharing the woods with moose hunters, and scientists are studying an environment that is somehow both preserved and exploited at the exact same time. It's not a pure wilderness, it's a landscape of compromise. And that, right there, is the big takeaway. Conservation is almost never just about neutral, objective science. It's a human story, it's a cultural project that gets deeply shaped by the values, the biases, and yeah, the personal desires of the people who have the power to make the rules. In the end, the park we see today wasn't shaped by ecological principles alone. It was shaped by one powerful group's very specific vision of what nature should be and who should get to enjoy it. And that leaves us with this huge question that we should be asking about pretty much any conservation effort, past or present. When we decide to protect nature, who are we really protecting it for?